Everyone for joining us today for this workshop on translating artificial intelligence into clinical practice, which is part of the Demystifying Regulation and Commercialization series by the Christabel Pankhurst Institute at the University of Manchester. My name is Christopher Yao, and I'm Professor of Artificial Intelligence at the University of Manchester, where I'm a Turing AI Fellow. I'm joined today by my colleagues, Professor Angela Davies and Dr. David Wong, in hosting this workshop. And we hope to bring you an exciting and highly knowledgeable lineup of speakers this afternoon. And we were motivated to set up this workshop to capitalize on the rapidly growing industry of artificial intelligence in healthcare, which has expanded significantly in recent years due to the increasing pervasiveness of computer data, and also the opportunity that automation potentially offers for improving patient care and outcomes across a range of different settings. However, there's also an increasing recognition that the development of AI systems requires more than pure technological innovation. And just like any other medical technology, necessitates wider considerations, including safety, ethical and legal concerns, as well as ensuring equal opportunity for all parts of society to share in its benefits. So the purpose of this workshop today is to provide a starting point for understanding the emerging thinking around AI, guidelines and evidence requirements and regulatory frameworks in healthcare that I believe is essential for transforming ideas and concepts into delivered healthcare solutions. And we hope this will be of use and of guidance to a range of audience members. So our workshop today will be divided into 3 sessions. After an introduction by myself and Niels Peek, we'll move on to the first session. Will be chaired by David, which will be looking at reporting guidelines for AI clinical trials and the NHS X Awards. We'll then have a short break for 10 minutes before we jump into session 2, which will be chaired by myself, where we'll be looking at some of the implementation challenges and the regulatory information that's required for AI medical devices. In the final session, we'll have a panel discussion with all of our speakers, and that will be chaired by Angela. And we hope to finish all of this by 3:30. So for those of you who are going to be watching the football at 5 o'clock, you have plenty of time to prime yourself and prepare yourself for that match. During the talks, please use the chat box to ask any questions. If time allows, the chairs will pick 1 or 2 for responses immediately following the talks, or we'll try to insert them into the panel discussion. Our speakers can also respond by chat to your questions as well. And if not, we might be able to pass on any questions to the speakers via email. So if you want a response by email, please do leave behind an email address so we can forward the reply to you. But first, I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Professor Niels Peek, to open the workshop by saying a few words about the Pankhurst Institute, where he is Digital Health and Care Lead, and his role in the Greater Manchester area. Niels.
Thanks, Chris. Really excited to be here. I think this is a hugely important topic. So it's great that we have this workshop today. Thank you, and thanks to the other organizers for setting this workshop up. I've prepared a few slides to tell you more about the Pankhurst Institute. So let me start by sharing those. I hope you can see this. So Christabel Pankhurst Institute for Health Technology Research and Innovation was established earlier this year in January. As Chris was saying, I'm the lead for digital health and care at that institute. I'm also a professor of health informatics at the School of Health Sciences at the University of Manchester. So what is the Pankhurst Institute? It's an institute that integrates research on health technology and innovation across all the 3 faculties from the University of Manchester, and it aims to accelerate the translation of health technologies and create opportunities for business growth. We've got 2 broad focus areas. One is digital technologies and the other one is advanced materials. The main reason that we have those 2 broad areas is that these are the areas of strength at Manchester. That doesn't mean that other health technologies are necessarily excluded, but this is where we will focus on. And obviously we will also address all the related human, social and organizational factors. So what we aim to do with the Institute is create a well-supported continuous translational pathway, all the way from basic technology research to deployment of technologies at scale in the NHS. The Institute is funded by a consortium, including the Manchester Local Growth Fund. As I mentioned, the Virtual Institute was launched in January. There's going to be a building. The activities on that have actually started recently. It's going to be on Dover Street, right at the heart of the Oxford Road campus of the university. And that should be finished by spring next year. So I'm the lead for digital health and care in the Institute, and obviously that relates to our focus of today, which is on AI. Let me tell you a little bit about digital health and care at the University of Manchester. We tend to look at this as composed of three broad areas: algorithms, systems, and people. Well, the algorithms bit focuses on the development of new algorithms from data. The systems bit focuses on how do we deploy those algorithms to make changes to health and care services and pathways. And the people bit focuses on the supporting individual people's well-being, for instance, through apps and wearable biosensors. And again, obviously, there is an element of deployment of those algorithms. And the three areas are obviously connected, but it's useful to make these distinctions we find. And we've got a broad range of projects ongoing across the three faculties and across these three areas. So in the Pankhurst Institute, we focus on the translational pathway for health technology and innovation. So I've pulled together a slide which aims to illustrate what we how we look at that. And we think of that pathway as one that should start with gathering unmet needs from patients, clinicians, and services. And once we have those, we can try to identify resources to address those unmet needs, develop the technology that would address those unmet needs, perform translational research into feasibility, safety, acceptability, and effectiveness of that technology, and finally implement the technology in the NHS, which would require that the technology is adopted, continue to be used, scaled up, spread, and made sustainable. Once we've done all of that, we finally have what we set out to do in the first instance, I think, is to have real world impact with technology. And typically what we would then also find is that by doing that implementation, we will identify further unmet needs. And we probably also find that what we have developed isn't perfect. So that's where the journey would start again. Now, very often, I think we don't really follow this cycle as I just described, but we might start at different places. So for instance, we might start at the technology development and then try to move to implementation very quickly, only to find out that you can not do that so quickly, but you have to go to translation first. And then you find out that that is extremely resource intensive. So you need to find money. And then funders will tell you, well, what is the problem that you were trying to solve? So it isn't often as linear as the diagram suggests. And I think that's perfectly fine, as long, I think, as you're aware of, you know, what these different stages are and when you should look at them, and particularly what is required at the different stages and who should be involved. I think the main challenges are not so much in the rectangles in this diagram, but in the arrows. So going from one stage to the other. I think that's where we typically tend to struggle. And that's also, I think, the main reason why we felt it was necessary to have a university-wide institute, the Pankhurst Institute, to address that translational pathway, to help with support for the arrows in this diagram. I think at each of those arrows, we typically have to bridge a gap. So for instance, and typically between two fields. So for instance, between technology and health. And as we try to do that, we always find that there are so many things that we need to learn from the other side before we can have a meaningful conversation. So we have to learn to speak the language from the other side, but we have to also understand what drives people and drives organizations at the other side, and how we, for instance, can access resources. So if you work with the NHS, how do you actually make use of resources within the NHS? It's a huge challenge if you come from a university setting. And I think also it's useful to understand what the obsessions are at the other side. So I think currently, for instance, in health and care, health inequality is probably the biggest obsession. So it's useful to understand what is meant by that, and how, if and how we can address that through technology. But it's certainly something you can't ignore if you want to do anything in the health and care domain. And also the opposite of the obsessions, the taboos. So what is it that you can't do, or at least can't speak about? This is between technology and health, but it's equally true for any of the other arrows. So at some point, if you want to make things scalable and sustainable, I think you always have to work with industry. So that means you're going to have to liaise with the business domain. And again, you have all these problems of, understanding the language, understand what drives people, organizations, how to access resources, understand obsessions and taboos. So that's it from my side. I look forward to the workshop. Thank you for listening. Feel free to get in touch. I've got our web site here, email address, and our Twitter handle. And thank you very much for listening.
Great, thank you, Niels. Thank you for that great introduction to the Pankhurst. And welcome once again for anyone who may have just joined us. So in the next 45 minutes, we're going to have two short talks. And so first up, I'd like to introduce Professor Alistair Dennison and Dr. Xiao Liu, who both work at the University of Birmingham and at the local trust there, University Hospitals Birmingham. And so in the last couple of years, they've been leading really hugely significant work that's standardizing the development and reporting of clinical trials, particularly involving AI. So thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, and I'll hand straight over to you both now. I'm only sorry that we can't have an introductory round of applause for you.
Thanks, David. No, that's great. Right, it's great to be here, and thank you, Niels, for setting the context so nicely. So we're going to touch on a few things here, but we do want to try and leave room for discussions. So reporting guidelines for clinical trials of AI interventions. So why do we need to have a talk specifically about this? So next slide, please. What we're going to cover is the evidence gap in AI for healthcare, which actually Niels has touched on already, issues with reporting and study design, and why do we need specific reporting guidelines for AI, if we do. Then we're going to talk about the particular area that we've led on internationally, but then also come back to set it in context in terms of next steps. So the evidence gap, I love this phrase, biology is experiencing its AI moment. So, for those who come perhaps more from the computer science side, it must be sometimes exasperating to just see the rest of the world trying to catch up with their Me Too moments. But here we are. So just look at this, the state of AI report showing where we're headed. This was before the 2020 numbers were formalized, but over 21,000 papers in 2020 alone, and going up exponentially. And there's to say that the kind of the output here is coming in really high impact papers. So some of this is genuinely sector leading and potentially world changing. But there was increasingly concern that actually not everything that was coming through was of the kind of quality that these top-ranking medical journals would normally expect to see. And there are a number of reasons why this might be happening, and we can touch on those. Next slide, please. And and as you saw, as those papers were coming up, a huge range of conditions being considered. So Zhao and I are both ophthalmologists. I'm a professor of ophthalmology, University of Birmingham, honorary chair there, plus a practicing ophthalmologist in University Hospitals Birmingham. And Zhao is also an ophthalmologist and is postdoctoral research fellow within the University of Birmingham. So we have particular domain expertise in that area, but the same tools are being used, you know, whether it's in recognition, sort of diagnostic assessment of chest x-rays, skin lesions for skin cancer, and so on. So the potential applications are huge. So about 2 to 3 years ago, we wanted to look at this question of actually how good are these tools really? You know, they're being published in the top journals, but how much could we actually trust them, and how much could this actually inform what medical practice on the ground, the sort of decision making that organizations such as the regulators, such as MHRA, and we have Johan with us today, or NICE making health technology assessments. What's the level of evidence that these critical gatekeepers would have to make their decisions? So Zhao led on a systematic review and meta-analysis, which identified 20,500 papers relevant to the question of AI diagnostics based on medical imaging. When you looked through all 20,500, you found only 82 studies that were of sufficient standard so that could go into the qualitative synthesis. When you looked at those that could go into the meta-analysis, comparing the algorithm performance to the healthcare professional, you're down to 69. If you looked at those that included not just internal validation, but an external validation test set, you were down to 25. And by the time you looked at the papers that actually did a head-to-head comparison of a healthcare professional versus the algorithm on that same data set, external validation, you're down to 14. So we realized at this point that actually we have a significant issue here. The concerns amongst the community about AI hype appearing in medical journals were well-founded. Interestingly, one of the findings of this report was that in that less than 1% of studies where it was robustly done and where you could really trust the findings, that actually the performance of these algorithms was matching healthcare professionals. So we were hitting that critical bar of a non-inferiority to human performance. And interestingly, this paper was widely reported in mainstream media, but the headline that carried was not the "we've got a problem with evidence," the quality of evidence, but was the, you know, computers as good as humans, or as the Sun put it, "yes, we scan." So again, this desire from the public to really pull these exciting tools and stories through faster than perhaps the evidence aligns is something we need to be really aware of. And this is not just the non-medical public, this is also perhaps in the health sector. There's a real desire, more than perhaps any other technology we've seen, that the answer is yes until proven otherwise, rather than a more kind of even assessment. So we called out a number of issues which are listed here that are issues of concern in some of these studies coming through, and there have been a number of other studies which have looked at similar issues. So this is a study in MPG Digital Medicine from earlier this year, which looked at prospective studies. And then there's the nice paper from Nagendra and et al, which identified 10 published RCTs for deep learning with 8 ongoing, 81 non-randomized clinical trials identified, but only 9 prospective, and 6 of which were tested in real-world clinical setting. And it's worth noting this quote, even in the discussion section of the paper, a call for prospective studies or trials in the case of existing prospective work was only made in 31 of 81, so 38% of studies. So next slide, please. So Zhao, I'll hand over to you at this point.
Sure. So picking up seamlessly. So there are a number of trials that are starting to emerge. This table in the blue was tweeted by Eric Topol sometime early in 2020. And at the time, there were mainly trials in looking at colonoscopy, adenoma detection. Most of them were done in China, and since then we've seen another few come through, both in actual clinical trial reports, but also encouragingly publication of clinical trial protocols setting out what they're going to do as well. And there's often this discussion around, do we need randomized control trials for AI systems? Do we, can we get away with not doing it? Do we really need it? And lots of different reasons for that. RCTs are slow, they're massive investment, they're unnecessary, they shouldn't really be a barrier to roll out. And also coming from the other side that, medical AI systems are special in some way. They have really rapid software update cycles that you have to enjoy their full advantages. You need to let it learn from new data, allow the frequent iterations of updating. And the other one that often comes up is, well, the decision support, they're augmenting human clinicians and they're not fully autonomous, therefore the risk is low. And it's kind of, I put slightly facetiously the quote from Mark Zuckerberg about move fast and break things. And when we have that discussion, I've recently started pointing to this study, which was published in the BMJ this year, which was of a non-AI electronic health record-based alert system for acute kidney injury. And this was a parallel design RCT, and we've seen studies like this looking at machine learning algorithms that would ordinarily have measured the accuracy of the alerts. But the special thing about this study was that they actually measured outcomes. So outcomes in terms of mortality, the need for dialysis, and progression of the acute kidney injury. And they looked at this in 6 hospitals, 4 teaching hospitals, large hospitals, and 2 smaller non-teaching hospitals. And what they found was that there was no overall beneficial effect in the larger hospitals, but there was also quite a bit of variation about the effect between these 6 hospitals, in that in the 2 non-teaching hospitals, there appeared to be harm, where a larger proportion of patients went on to develop need for dialysis, mortality, and progression of AKI. And so I put this up because it's kind of a reminder that, you think about an alert system. It's not a interventional, it's not a therapeutic intervention, but it still has the ability to cause harm. And so seemingly innocuous interventions like this can also cause harm. And this couldn't have been detectable if it weren't for a prospective interventional design. And so we do need these kinds of studies to fully assess the impact. And so in 2014, Mark Zuckerberg changed the move fast and break things quote to move fast with stable infra. And I think what we need in a healthcare AI is move fast, but with robust evidence and watertight safety netting. So we announced the Spirit AI and Consult AI initiative to try and tackle some of the problems that we've seen before with the quality of evidence. What we wanted to do was avoid the same problems with reporting that we'd seen in observational studies with in RCTs. And this is particularly because RCTs tend to be the last hurdle to get through in terms of providing evidence before these products will become widespread use in health systems. And so the Spirit AI and Consult AI initiative is an international collaborative effort to try and improve the transparency and completeness of reporting for clinical trials, evaluating interventions involving AI. And so we made the announcement in late 2020, formed a steering group, invited participants to take part in giving their opinions. We went through a multi-stage consensus process where we generated a number of items and put them to a vote through 3 rounds of a Delphi study. And we met in early 2020 to come to a final consensus on the items that should go in. And if you're not familiar with SPIRIT and CONSORT, these are really well-established reporting guidelines that are used in medicine, widely endorsed by medical journals. So SPIRIT 2013 is a guideline for writing clinical trial protocols, and CONSORT 2010 is probably the oldest and most widely adopted reporting guideline we have for clinical trial reports. And the way that they're used is at the point at which you submit your manuscript for publication, you have to submit it alongside the checklist. And you have to tick or indicate where in your manuscript you've satisfied these reporting items. And it helps the reviewers and the editors assess whether you've provided the right amount of information for the reader to be able to assess risk of bias and replicate your research. So over the years, people have taken the standard SPIRIT and CONSORT guidelines and added on extra items to suit different study designs and different interventions. And so that's what we've done with AI. We've added extra items on top of the standard items. So when you use them, you would have to address all of the items in total. So I'm just going to really quickly whiz through the items. There's not enough time really to go through any of them in detail, and some of them do require a bit of a nuanced discussion. But really straightforward things, we ask that authors indicate that the intervention involves AI/ML in the title and the abstract, mainly for indexing purposes. We ask the authors to identify, to define the intended use, the intended users, and how it fits in the context of the clinical pathway. We ask authors to separate the eligibility criteria at the level of the participants, and then again at the level of the input data. And the reason for this is to try and avoid conflating the selection criteria in terms of the population and the disease areas that you're trying to target versus those technical requirements that your algorithm needs. And so one is about who and when, who and in what type of disease your intervention is going to work in. And the second part is about what kind of weird artifacts or quality metrics do you require for your algorithm to work as intended. And so this is about separating those two so that the two aren't conflated. We've got a number of items about how the algorithm is implemented, defining exactly which version it was, aligning it to any regulatory markings such as unique device identifiers, so that there's some traceability in terms of matching up the evidence that you publish to the device that's on the market at the moment, or the one that you are trying to appraise as part of your health technology appraisal right now. There are a few items about how the input data was acquired, the data that's being essentially ingested by the algorithm, how it's acquired, if there were any particular requirements in terms of quality, whether there was any normalization, any pre-processing, all those things that can make or break the algorithm's performance. And then on the output side, to specify whether there was a human AI interaction and what were the requirements, was there any training provided to the users and any instructions. And in fact, there will be a more detailed breakdown about the human factors involved in using AI systems in an upcoming guideline called Decide AI, which is being led by Oxford Group, Baptiste Fazey and Peter McCulloch, that looks at early feasibility studies for AI interventions. And there's a whole section on human factors in there for that type of study. We also have an item on the analysis of performance errors, trying to identify failure modes and trying to nudge authors to move beyond just reporting aggregate performance and starting to look at the cases of errors and why they happened, and defining risk mitigation strategies to avoid them in the future. So a few examples of how you might go about doing this. At the top, I've got some ROC plots from a colleague who, if we just look at the top right one, for example, this is looking at pneumothorax detection in chest x-rays. If you look at the aggregate performance only, which is in the middle line, it's got a perfectly acceptable AUC of 0.87. But then if you separate the cohort out into those that included chest strains and those that included no chest strains, you find that the pneumothoraxes that don't have chest strains in the image suddenly aren't as well detected as the ones that do. And that's a clue that perhaps your algorithm is not really detecting the right disease feature, but instead it's looking at artifacts that aren't to do with the lungs at all. And it's these kinds of analyses, and the one below is use of saliency maps to look to see where the which features are bringing about the output of the algorithm. So this is another one looking at COVID prediction using chest x-rays and identifying that the model seemed to be looking at the laterality markers in the chest x-rays and the shoulder position, as opposed to anything in the chest itself. So exploring errors is really important for AI, because it has a tendency to make errors that are perhaps difficult to foresee and which humans might not make, but can have really bad consequences. And then lastly, there's an item on stating whether or not the AI algorithm can be accessed and if there's any restrictions to the access or reuse. So we published the guidelines in Nature Medicine and Lancet Digital Health and BMJ last year. And I think this is the point I meant to hand back to Alistair.
So I'll take over. So there was a fantastic steering group and consensus group, including some of the people on this meeting. So thank you, Chris, amongst others. And but what's been really exciting since we provided that, which was the first Equator Group international guidelines in the field, is the level of impact that we've seen, and so thanks to all the various bodies and journals that have really run with this and have found it useful in helping to improve the kind of the reporting. So if we go to the next slide, there's when they launched, there was, as I say, simultaneously published in 3 journals, but probably just as important was the number of journals that actually ran commentary articles on these, saying actually this is addressing a need. Now, one of the things that Zhao highlighted is that this was designed for, particularly in the context of parallel, so randomized controlled trials. But actually, a lot of these items are generally applicable. These are things that in any evaluation you're looking at of an AI intervention in healthcare are factors you need to be considering. So as a number of other guidelines for particular niches have come through, you'll see that they're adopting very similar set of challenges and items to consider. If you're interested, the website clinicaltrials.ai includes an interactive guideline for how to use this, and there's you can both download the checklist, but also there's an interactive list that can kind of provide a commentary on what the different items are. So I'll just skip to the next slide. So there are a number of guidelines now coming through, and if you ever get confused and wonder how they fit together, they're generally focused on particular scenarios. So as I say, Zhao mentioned, Spirit AI is around the reporting of a protocol for a particular study. Consort is based on the longest standing guideline, which is for randomized controlled trials. So Consort AI is what you would use in that context. There are 2 other guidelines from the International Equator Group to be aware of. One is STARD for tests of diagnostic test accuracy studies. So if that's what you're particularly focused on, rather than outcomes, that's what you would be looking for. And if you're looking at evaluation of prediction model, that's Tripod ML, as it's called, but I think they're running with Tripod AI as the main title. And then we've already mentioned Decide AI, which is around human factors. So these all contain some overlapping items, but also particular items that are specific to the area you're looking at. But as I say, they inform your understanding of evaluation in the healthcare setting. Next slide, please. And we're just coming to land. I'm not going to touch on this, but one of the contexts for and areas that we work with many of the people on this call is in the context of the Health and Care Award, which is the subject of the next talk. So I think we'll finish there. David, thank you very much for your sharing, and our contact details are here top right.
Great, thank you very much, Alistair and Zhao. I think we've done a great job of keeping to time. So I think we've got time for one question, and I see that Fabio in the chat has asked about any advice on when to implement AI tech in healthcare through quality improvement versus, I guess, traditional research methodology. And I guess this might fit in a little bit with the Decide AI stuff.
Yeah, this is actually one of those superficially simple but actually highly complex questions. And I suspect amongst others, Johan from the MHRA will be interested to see how we answer this. So Xiao, how would you answer this particular question? Then I'll come in with my 5 pence worth.
I mean, first of all, I think it depends on the maturity of the algorithm and whether it's a CE marked device or not. And HRA have really good guidance in terms of whether what you're planning to do evaluation-wise constitutes research or other. So that's my general go-to in terms of that. Given that we have very few AI systems that are in use as part of standard clinical care, most will be evaluated as research for now. Some of them may come under post-market surveillance or post-market clinical follow-up. Again, I'll let Johan comment on that one. But we'll probably find that most AI systems are coming under research for now.
Yeah, if I can echo that, just to say that this is an important question as well, because actually there is a real enthusiasm to evaluate these systems in live healthcare setting, and you do just have to be careful about that your driver to want to do that and to try and slip it in under a quality improvement agenda when actually it's not appropriate. If these are untested, and if they're affecting, the moment they're affecting clinical care and pathways. I don't know, David, Johan, would it be okay? Would you like to comment on this?
Yeah, Johan, do you want to maybe just 1 minute? That's all right, and then we can pick it up later as well.
I won't even take 30 seconds, David. Look, I think exactly what Alistair and Zal has said is correct. I'll just point people towards the MHRA's in-house exemption guidance as well, but also noting that the EU medical device regulation has its new revamped in-house exemption called the health use exemption. So that's probably the exemption you'll be looking to rely upon if you're a researcher looking to deploy it in those settings. But I think we'd encourage people, to do a clinical investigation, notify the MHRA wherever possible. I think that's best practice if you can possibly put it in your research timeline. That would be my view. And of course, HRA process as well. Less than 30 seconds, David. I think I get a gold star.
Thank you very much. Good job. And thank you once again, Alistair and Joe, for your talk. Very useful as an engineer. The whole idea of checklists for me was a whole new world moving into medicine. And Matt, I've seen your question in the chat. We'll pick that up again in the panel, if that's okay. So our next speaker is Dr. Paul Bromley. Paul works in health data science and is a colleague at the University of Manchester with a focus on computer vision applied to clinical applications. He's also got a real vast experience in technology transfer, having worked with a number of medtech companies. And most recently, he's chaired the review panel for phase 3 and phase 4 of the NIHR/NHSX Artificial Intelligence in Health and Care Awards, on which we've invited him to provide his unique insights today. So over to you, Dr. Bromley.
Okay, thank you. So can you hear me?
Yes, thanks.
Okay, I'll just share my screen. Can you see my slide deck? David, can you see my slide deck?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So thanks for the invitation to speak here today. I've been asked to say a few words about the NIHR AI in Health and Care Awards, and in particular, what makes a compelling evidence case for an application to this award scheme. So in terms of some background, in 2019, the NHS published the long-term plan, which very clearly calls for an increase in the use of AI in healthcare in a number of particular areas, and also more generally, but particularly in things like radiology and histology. In August 2019, in response to that, the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care announced £250 million of government funding to be spent over 3 years for the formation of the NHS Artificial Intelligence Lab, to develop and adopt technologies that were most promising to meet this goal of the NHS long-term plan. And the role of the AI in Health and Care Awards is to take 140 million of that funding over 3 years to accelerate the testing and evaluation of the most promising technologies that have been identified, and to translate those through from research into clinical practice. Funding competitions run twice yearly for this scheme, and we've just finished competition 2, with competition 3 opening today. The awards are delivered by the AAC and NHSX, both of which are bodies that are, have a remit to identify technologies that could improve the efficiency and efficacy of NHS or social care services in the UK. And it's largely administered by the NIHR due to their experience with running funding schemes. And it has a relatively broad remit to identify and fund projects in a number of different areas that can broadly be characterized as health promotion and disease prevention, diagnosis and treatment, and system efficiency. But this can vary all the way from, for example, the use of computer-aided diagnostic systems in radiology to identify diseases in clinical imaging, all the way through to things like natural language processing for optimizing the efficiency of administrative tasks in the NHS. And the definition of AI that's being used is similarly broad. So it covers everything from machine learning through to computer-aided diagnostics, smart environments, and a wide range of other topics. And if you check the web address there, it contains a definition of AI that's being used in the context of these awards to decide what constitutes AI and what falls outside the remit. The idea of these awards is to translate technologies from development through into clinical practice. And so it focuses on movement along the translational pipeline, which are characterized by a number of phases. So at phase 1, we have initial feasibility testing to show the feasibility of some proposed AI technology in terms of a concept, a product, or a service. It should be noted that in the course of the award scheme, we're expecting to see technologies move along this pipeline through several different funding awards. And so phase 1 is now closed for new applications. So there's no phase 1 applications available for competition 3 or moving forwards. Phase 2 is initial development and clinical evaluation. It's typically using clinical data, but mostly in a laboratory setting. Phase 3 is your initial real-world testing, where you're doing your first feasibility studies in clinical settings. And phase 4 is initial health system adoption, where typically you're going to be taking your already proven intervention and deploying that within 3 to 5 different NHS or social care sites in the UK to gather evidence of efficiency and efficacy. Phase 5, full-scale national rollouts, are not covered by this funding scheme. In terms of award specifications, who can apply? So the lead organisation for any phase has to be located in the UK, although that's quite flexible. So organisations that are based outside of the UK, as long as they have a UK registered office or a UK health or social care organisations, a co-lead, are allowed to apply for this scheme. Your collaborators can be located anywhere as long as there's a clear trajectory to deployment within the NHS and benefit the NHS. And collaborators can be a wide variety of different kinds of organisations. Typically, you're always going to see a higher education institute involved, typically always an industrial partner, an SME, or a large enterprise for later phases. Charities are typically involved as well. There will always be an NHS or social care organisation as a partner, and local authorities are allowed to be co-applicants as well. You do have to have a minimum of 2 different types of organisation as applicants, and for practical purposes, one of those is always going to be a healthcare organisation. You can only submit to 1 phase in each competition. So you have to choose the phase you're submitting to based on how mature your technology is, how far along the translational pipeline it is. And the application process is a 2-stage process. So you submit an initial outline application that's subjected to peer review. We then have a meeting called the SIFT meeting, which involves members of the NIHR, AAC, NHSX, the panel chair, and often a few extra academics as well to pick up any loss of staff due to absences through COVID. At that meeting, the review scores are used to select the most promising applications and invite the applicants to submit a full application in stage 2, which is again peer reviewed. We then have a panel meeting where the applicants, or some subset of the applicants, so a maximum 3 of the applicants, which will typically be someone from higher education, an industrial partner, and an NHS representative, are allowed to give a short presentation where they address any comments raised in the peer reviews. And that's followed by a discussion of the entire panel led by the chair, in which we select as a group the applications that we're going to approve for funding. And that's followed then by a due diligence process organised by, in my phases, the AAC. So in terms of what makes for a strong application, I'm not going to focus on the technologies at all, because I see that as being largely irrelevant, because we cover such a wide range of different areas. The things that the reviewers will be looking for are firstly relevance and quality. So questions like how relevant and important is your proposed technology to the needs of the NHS or social care services? Does it offer a solution that has a demonstrable benefit to patients, to service users, or to carers? So that can be NHS staff as well. Has your technology been trained and validated on appropriate data sets? This isn't a funding scheme for blue sky research. This is a funding scheme to identify things that have already shown promise and accelerate their deployment within the NHS. And does the study design meet the stated objectives of your proposal? And so going back to some of the things that were spoken about in the previous talk. So when you're writing a case, you need to write a compelling case that there is an unmet need in health or social care, that your proposed solution can demonstrably address that unmet need, and in particular that you have clear plans for how you're going to move your innovation from its current status through into clinical practice. In that regard, I think this is one of the most important points. The thing to focus on is workflow integration. You might have a fantastic technology that's 95% accurate in identifying a particular disease in some kind of clinical image. But how are you going to integrate that into clinical practice? What does that mean for the clinicians who are working in this disease area? Does that figure of 95% mean that they need to inspect every single result from your system to identify the places where it's failed? Does that mean that you're actually increasing clinical workload rather than reducing it? Are you going to give them an extra set of imaging to look at, an extra system to manipulate? All of those things have to be considered, particularly in the context of an NHS where we have, in some areas, particularly in radiology, a massive shortfall in staff. We have well over 30% of radiology posts in the NHS are long-term vacant, and that's predicted to rise in the future. So if you're going to work in AI in radiology, you need to focus on reducing clinical workload and not increasing it. And so it's this issue of how you integrate into existing clinical systems that's particularly important for members of the panel and the reviewers. An essential component of every application is PPI, and many applications fall down on this point by trying to skim over this and assuming that people won't notice. Public and patient involvement is a core essential component of the grant that reviewers are asked about. In particular, how have patients been involved in developing your application? It's not sufficient to say we will hold a few meetings with some patients at some point during the grant and have no further detail than that. Patients should have been involved in developing the application. How are they going to be involved in project management? How are you going to ensure the patient voice is heard in your project? How are you going to inform patient groups about the results of your project and get their approval for the changes that you're going to make to their movement through the clinical system? In practice, although the guidance documents will say they advise that you can have a PPI representative, you must have a PPI representative on your team. You should have one as a co-applicant on your grant, or at the very least, someone on your project management team. If you need help, if you need to find patient representatives, if you're located at the University of Manchester, as presumably many people on this call are, we have an organisation in the Manchester University NHS Foundation Trust, which is a local NHS trust called Vocal, which organises patient representation on a number of different projects, particularly looking at disadvantaged groups. And so you can approach them, and I've included their web address here. But for more generally, almost every disease area will have a national charity that focuses on that disease area. I work a lot in MSK radiology, so I work with organisations like the Royal Osteoporosis Society, Versus Arthritis, but regardless of the disease area you're interested in, there will always be a national charity for that, and you can approach them, and typically they will have systems to organise patient representation for you, and you can recruit the lead of a local patient support group as a member of your project team, and you can organise meetings with patients through those support groups. Moving on from PPI to an associated issue, I've included this one largely because it annoys me so much. And that is that each one of these applications has a lay summary, a plain English summary. This is a short component of the application form in which you have to provide a clear explanation of the project in language suitable for publication to the lay public. It's only 450 words long, but this is one area where a large number of applicants simply don't put in the required effort. And bearing in mind that this is the first thing the reviewers are going to read, it's worthwhile making sure you get this right. It should be understandable by members of the public, because if the grant is accepted, this will be published on the NIHR website. And so it's not sufficient to simply word swap your scientific abstract to try to dumb down the language you're using. You should write something bespoke for this purpose, which explains to patients why this is important, why there's an unmet need, how your project is going to address that unmet need, and how it's going to affect them. You should avoid any academic or business jargon, avoid the use of acronyms, and this is one area where PPI involvement is so important. You can work with your PPI representative to write this, this lay summary. I've lost count of the number of grants where I've had to add to the feedback given to the applicants at the end of the panel meeting, saying your lay summary is not fit for purpose and needs to be rewritten from scratch. Since there's a focus on translation, another important area here is business planning. So you need to be making the case that you're preparing your technology for a full-scale national rollout. And in practical terms, that almost always means that you're going to need an industrial collaborator. Particularly at phases 3 or 4, you need to include evidence around regulatory approval, CE marking or some other equivalent. It's usually CE marking. Phase 2 applications, you need to show that you're gathering the evidence to apply for regulatory approval. For a phase 3 application, you need to have already obtained regulatory approval, or obtaining that needs to be imminent. So you need to have applied with confidence that you're going to get it. And obviously for phase 4, you need to have regulatory approval in place. Gaining those regulatory approvals usually means you're going to need to adhere to a whole bunch of different ISO standards, 6001, 13485, data management plans. If you don't know what those numbers are, that indicates that you need an industrial collaborator or a consultant who will be able to manage that for you. You need to have IP management plans in place. You're going to need to include a health economics study as a work package in your grant. At phase 4, that's going to be involve a TSET, a technology specific evaluation team. So an independent team at another university who's going to do that for you. But all of these are components that feed into that wide-scale rollout. All of these gather the evidence and the case you need to build a business case around how you're going to persuade a CCG or some other equivalent organization to adopt your solution. Having identified those components, you can then speak about the team. So the reviewers are going to be asked, does the team have the breadth of expertise necessary for the project? But in particular, you're going to need PPI involvement, you're going to need NHS involvement, and you're going to need an industrial collaborator on the team, each bringing a separate skill set to the overall package. In terms of application success rates, so at competition 2, we received 366 applications at phase 1. Getting through to phase 2 is a fairly significant hurdle. We lose most of the applications at that stage, but we recommended 38 applications for final funding. So for example, in phase 3, that was 10 out of 21 applications that had gone through to stage 2. And in phase 4, that was 5 out of 7. So once you get through to that stage 2 application, your chances of being funded are pretty much 50–60%. As I mentioned, the next competition is just opening. So the launch is today. The deadline for the stage 1 submission is the 7th of September, 1 p.m. UK time. Outcomes will be announced week commencing 18th of October, and applicants invited for a stage 2 if they've got through the stage 1 application. The deadline for stage 2 submission is the 23rd of November, and outcomes will be announced in February next year. So to summarize, I hope you can see that the existence of the AI and Health and Care Awards demonstrates a clear government and NHS commitment to identifying promising AI technologies and translating them through into clinical practice. And that should be encouraging for everyone here. In terms of this particular funding scheme, you need to focus on how you're going to achieve adoption into clinical practice and how this will lead to patient benefit. And so you should ensure that you've addressed each one of those aspects in the application. How are you going to develop patient benefit? How is the patient voice heard in your project? How will you integrate successfully into existing clinical workflows? And how are you going to manage that scaling up to regional, national, or international scale? And so you can, as a first step, go to the NIHR website. I've included the web address here, and read the documentation that describes this particular funding scheme. So I will stop sharing there. And
great, thank you very much, Paul. That was an excellent talk, and better, probably even better than hearing it directly from NHSX. And we're really grateful that you're able to offer that advice. It's real gold dust there, the kind of inner workings of how these proposals are evaluated. So thank you very much. Please do continue to ask any questions in the chat. But for now, we are going to take a short break. We're going to reconvene at 2:15 for the next set of sessions that Professor Yao will be chairing. Great, thank you very much, and thanks once again to Paul, Xiao, and to Alistair as well for this session. Thanks.
Our first speaker in this session is Maria Crispin from the University of Cambridge, where she's a university lecturer in integrated cancer medicine. I know Maria mostly from her cancer research, but she also has an alter ego who works extensively in health related policy as well. And I think we're going to be hearing more about her work in this area today. So without further ado, I shall hand over to her.
Thanks, Chris. I'm going to share my screen now. Hopefully you can see that.
Yes, we can.
Yeah, okay, great. So thanks so much, Chris, for your introduction. And as you've said, I wear, I guess, two hats, one as a researcher at the University of Cambridge and another one worrying more about the implications of all of the work that we're doing in the technical sphere. And thank you so much for inviting me today, because I think the workshop is really wonderful. I've really enjoyed the previous two talks, and I like that they focused on the AI solutions in themselves. We've heard about the guidelines, the importance of the technical robustness of the proposals, and also how to make a compelling proposition to actually get funded and be able to have impact. And so what I wanted to do in my talk was to talk a little bit more about the environment and the ecosystem of AI solutions. And it's going to be really like a list of ideas and some questions that we can also discuss later, either immediately after the talk or during the panel debate. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about today started with a report that I led at the Center for the Governance of Change, which is an academic think tank based at IE University in Madrid. And we published a report last year that was asking the question of how is artificial intelligence reshaping healthcare in Europe. And one of our big concerns was that we thought that a lot of the debate around AI had this major issue of being very generic. A lot of the time you hear in the media about AI as an idea, as a concept, as the AI that is going to take over. And this debate, unfortunately, often ignores the complexity of the healthcare environment, and sometimes the actual landscape of what is being developed, of what is being approved and implemented, gets hidden by that noise. And I think that a lot of that is due to this natural inheritance of AI from the big tech arena, and we've already heard about this before in the first talk, the fact that we inherit from this move fast and break things kind of motto, big scale, flashy results, moving quickly, etc. And of course, you would absolutely get fired if you were a surgeon and that was your key motto. So healthcare is more like, from my point of view, like a delicate environmental equilibrium. It's an entire ecosystem where data and machine learning advances are necessary seeds, necessary triggers. They're what pushes the progress forward, I guess. But a lot has to happen around them, and we've already heard about the review process, about the robustness, about the clinical trials, etc. We're also going to hear later from Johan about the regulation and the policy that underlies all of this. So what I want to do is describe this landscape a little bit more. So look at what it is that is being approved and how that may impact the engagement with patients, and also other important questions, important elements like education, the situation of the healthcare workforce, etc. And these are actually just two elements, but there are many more, so we could spend hours and hours talking about this. And I'm going to try and have a very global perspective on this too, because I think that sometimes when you are in a place like the UK, which is a clear leader in so many aspects of healthcare AI, it's sometimes easy to lose track of what's happening in other places. But I think that this is a very, very fluid, very well communicated field where it's important to know what's going on in other places to kind of predict what may happen here as well, and benefit from what is being learned in other areas. So I wanted to start by looking at what's happening in Europe in terms of AI tools that have CE marking, where they're coming from, who's developing them, and what are they. And there's a couple of interesting messages, I think. One is, if you look at the distribution with the countries on the x-axis and the number of approvals on the y-axis, the US is dominating. But in fact, if you look at the leading countries in Europe, so Germany, England, UK, France, Netherlands, Sweden, it's almost double. So in fact, it's a very healthy production from European countries. If you add Israel, it goes to more than 106. Another interesting message here is that it's still not huge numbers, right? We're talking of tens, hundreds, a couple of hundred maybe devices, not more than that. So this also tells us that we're still at an early stage where things are moving, obviously, but there's still a lot that we can do and a lot that we can change. Interestingly, if you look at what's happening in the US, so if you look at FDA approvals of AI devices, there's this obvious huge peak for devices that have originated from the US itself, and that's unsurprising. But if you look at the total numbers, they're actually comparable to what is happening in Europe overall. Also, if you add up the contributions from these 6 countries that were just mentioned, Israel, Sweden, UK, France, Netherlands, and Germany, they're about the same as the number of products from the US that have been approved in the European market. And I think to me, this sends also an important message, which is that not only like do the tools seem to be evolving at a similar pace, but also the flows are equivalent. And so this again, reinforces this idea that this is really a global field. It's moving in the 2 directions in the Atlantic between these 2 foci of progress. And so it's really, really important that we are all kind of communicating with each other. And I think it's probably no surprise that the number of approvals is growing, and this only gets up to 2019. I mean, the paper was published just like 2 months ago, but that's where the data reaches. And I'm sure that if we added 2020 or 2021 to this, it would be even a more striking kind of exponential trend. But what might look, I think, surprising is that if you look at the speed of development, so what this graph is telling you here is for different types of tools that got approval in both the US and the EU, how long it took to get to the approval stage. And if the line is blue, that tells you that it was quicker in Europe, so the CE marking, than in the US. And I think this is an interesting result because sometimes there is this perception that Europe is this kind of like slow regulation heavy monster. And it's true that we care a lot about regulation, about guidelines, etc. But this doesn't need to be a barrier to innovating in a way that is, agile and efficient. These data suggest that it's not. And long term, I think what this tells me is that this can be a real strength of Europe, because we're innovating just as much as other world-leading centers, and this is coming together with a very robust underlying infrastructure in terms of regulation, in terms of guidelines, producing robust results. The other important thing I wanted to say is that there should be extra confidence in our ability to do this, because I was very intrigued and very happy to see this, that one of the studies that we included in the report had looked at the number of patents that had been filed in different countries, the different countries around Europe, starting in 1990 all the way to 2014, because that's when the data set kind of was complete. So it's a little bit out of date from that point of view, but it's consistent with what we're seeing in terms of the countries that have led the development. So if you look at what's called here tier 3, it's Germany, Netherlands, United Kingdom, France, followed very closely by Sweden as the first country in tier 2. So this is a number of patents that these countries filed in the area of digital health in the last couple of decades. So what this is telling you is that these countries that are leading the development of AI solutions that are getting approval have actually years and years of work behind that. So all of them have strong funding schemes, infrastructure to support digital health, or at least it's growing. And so this is a really solid foundation to create a very exciting future for AI in healthcare in Europe, which is, I think, very reassuring. So what happens if we look at the actual tools, like what do they do? And the great majority of the devices that are being approved, and here I'm only showing the European data, is radiology, basically. And I think this is not too surprising either. I mean, there's a strong case for AI in radiology. Also, the computer vision community has been very active. A lot of the developments in AI that have brought forward this recent revolution have been precisely for image analysis, so no surprise here. They're being developed by small companies, and most of them are actually designed to be used by healthcare professionals. They're not patient-facing. They're not meant to be used by patients. So I think this is interesting because it pictures a very, very, very concrete, very specific type of AI application that is getting through the regulatory approval process. And so one could be tempted to ask the question, is the debate that we hear about in the media hyped up? Are we really talking about something a lot more mundane than this AI, right? So are we simply talking about replacing a cog in a traditional system, so something as boring as reconstructing an MR image with an algorithm that is more efficient because it's based on deep learning or better, more accurate, as opposed to entirely revolutionizing the technology, the care pathway, the way in which we get the data, the way in which we analyze it, the way in which you receive it and perceive it, etc. And I think the answer to that question is pretty obvious. It's no. I mean, having this debate is absolutely essential, and there's a lot of reasons why. One is pretty trivial. The fact that a type of solution is less frequent doesn't mean that it's less important and that its consequences cannot be, just as good or just as bad. The other thing is also there are other ways of having impact on patient care. CE marking is not everything, so this is only giving a partial view, of course. Then there's the fact that there's a lot of things that are being developed. I think we saw earlier a figure too of the number of publications and how they're growing year after year. So there's a lot of things that are being developed in the pipeline that will reach us sooner rather than later. But ultimately, I think it all boils down to the importance of trust in the healthcare arena. We've seen it with COVID. When people don't trust an element of the care pathway, the whole system can be compromised. And so even if something sounds as boring as a tiny cog in a very complex system, and we also saw an example of that earlier when we were talking about these alarms in the electronic health records, they can cause harm and it can undermine public trust and as a result the whole healthcare system. And it's particularly important that we discuss this for AI applications because in fact data about how people perceive the different types of providers tells us that the least favorable providers are precisely the ones that usually the ones leading the development of these solutions. So players like Google, Amazon, Facebook, etc. they're seen as really not trustworthy. Whereas on the other end, we have the doctors, hospitals, the national healthcare systems. They're the ones that really can convey that trust to patients. And this is something that I'll talk about again in about a minute. So what happens when we ask people about AI and AI in healthcare? What's very common is that if you start from a very general type of interaction, and there's, I think, a lot of data now on this, people have usually mixed ideas, and very often they are negative, and they are driven by common perceptions of AI, robots, and things like that. But the moment that you go down to specific scenarios and you say, okay, let's talk about this application, let's really draw the whole picture and give you all of the details about the environment, then things change. And that's when you start getting views that are more nuanced, opinions that are more relevant to the development of the actual device. A lot of the time they will be more positive as well. And it's very important, and I think, it's eye-opening when you do this, to see that people really do care. I think it's very easy for us when we're developing a technical solution to think that it's going to be a useless exercise, but it really isn't. And this type of work, more focused on specific solutions, on specific applications, still needs a lot of development. And it's something I think that needs to grow in the future if we want these applications to really be successful. So an example of that, since we were talking about radiology, is the survey that was run among radiologists and in the European context, and it was published in 2019. And you can see some of the factors that were ranked as the most important sorry, I said radiologists, I meant patients. So patients were asked about radiology solutions. And what they said was that they found it worrisome that a computer does not take feelings into account, that it's important to have a good understanding of the results of a scan, that it's important to ask questions when getting the results, and that if a computer would give the results, they would not feel emotional support. And of course, this very clear underlying mistrust that is inherited from this global perception of AI as a technology. But I think that what is important here is that patients are giving a very clear idea of what it is that they want from this care pathway, from interacting with the radiologists. They want to be able to understand the scan. They want to be able to speak to the specialist and to have this kind of human interaction. And this can, in fact, inform how the solution itself is developed, because it might tell us about how we're going to design the interpretability aspect of the algorithm. So it can, in fact, have a technical impact, but also it is telling us about how the pathway has to be designed, and it's revealing opportunities for how we design that implementation beyond the actual technical contribution that the algorithm is making, to make space for the things that are really going to have an impact on how the patients are perceiving this new solution. And so going through this exercise is really incredibly helpful for all the parties involved. And the other very important thing here is, again, the role of clinicians. And this is why I wanted to highlight before the fact that clinicians play a critical role in the, from the point of view of trust, particularly for the patient experience. Clinicians need to be the key intermediaries in all of this. And if we look at what's happening in, for example, radiology, just to continue with the same example, there is still a knowledge gap. So this is, again, an area where a lot still needs to happen. So these are results that were published very recently this year. And they asked radiologists about their knowledge of AI and their perception of AI in the context of radiology. And about 50% of them didn't know statistics or informatics. They didn't know how to code. Quite a few of them knew AI or felt that they had a basic intermediate understanding of AI, but that was not supported by an underlying understanding of the statistics or how they are implemented code-wise. Of course, this has an effect on how they perceive these solutions. So if you look at the 3 right-hand side points, that tells you the level of knowledge of machine learning and AI, and you can see that the more that they know, the more open and proactive they tend to be. So it's really, really important that this is addressed, because the more confident the clinicians are in explaining these solutions, the better that connection is going to happen with the patients. I think I'm running out of time, so I just wanted to leave this here and say this is a huge discussion that has been already explored in reports like the Topol review. And it's important that we realize that it's a change that needs to happen, not just for clinicians, but also for the educators that need to be prepared to deliver this type of very new interdisciplinary type of education. We need incentives, we need the data scientists also to be prepared to interact with the clinicians. There's a huge challenge that we'll need to address, well, basically now. And I will stop here with this image of the ecosystem, just to prepare for the discussion later. And thank you very much for listening, and I'll be happy to take questions now, later, or offline.
Thanks, Maria. That was a great talk, and thanks for bringing the European patients as well as kind of the interpretation perspective into this. I think I will actually move on to the next speaker. I did notice your question in the chat box, Matt, but I think the person to answer that question may be actually our next speaker, potentially, if he wants to go there. So our next speaker is Johan Ordish. He's from MHRA, where he has responsibility for software as medical devices, or more specifically today he's going to be talking about AI as a medical device. And without further ado, I'll hand over to him.
Thank you so much. Chris, hopefully you can hear me. Can you just...
Yes, I can hear you.
And I think I've got a flat half an hour, but I'll try to finish at the turn of the hour. Is that helpful, Chris?
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Take half an hour if you need to.
Good, fantastic, good. Well, hi. So as Chris said, I'm Johan. I am the group manager for medical device software at the MHRA. We're responsible for most aspects of regulating all this stuff. What is software as a medical device? I hope to answer that in a second to give you a better idea. But really, I think I wanted this session to be really two purposes. One is kind of more on the educational side. What is it? What are we doing? Where are we going? But also, really, the UK is frankly now a smaller market than it was when we're part of the European Union. So we need to play to our comparative advantages. One of our comparative advantages is really best-in-class academia, which you're all a part of. So essentially, MHRA needs to engage.
Well, just reckon James went to the mosque when he went off.
That's interesting. Someone is not muted. Hope that person will find the mute button in just a second. Never mind. Where was I going forward? So if we can engage you as much as we can, I'm really looking forward to steal all of your kind of shiny objects that might contribute to the safety and the effectiveness of medical devices in the UK, but I'm sure we can pick that up in just a second. Right. Next slide. Should be going. Good. So just a quick disclaimer, this doesn't necessarily represent government policy. I'm not giving you advanced views on government policy, so please don't hold me accountable to some of that. So medical device regulation, where does it fit? So on the very left side, you have the regulation of research. That's the Health Research Agency, things like that, all the way to the data itself, which is also with the HRA, or the Information Commissioner's Office, or the National Data Guardian, and so on. And that regulation of data is not just when you're training your machine learning model, but also when you're inputting inputs into it later on once you're deployed. So it kind of consists throughout the process. Medical device regulation is in that kind of that orange hexagon there. It's regulation of the product. So in very, very general terms, it asks, what do you have to do before you go to market, and what do you have to do to stay on the market in terms of safety and effectiveness? And I'll go into more details soon. But further down the process, you also have regulation of the service. So if it's included as a service or constitutes a service, that will be regulated by the Care Quality Commission. You also have wider assurance frameworks. So for instance, NHS Digital's DCB standards, but also NHSX's new process called the Digital Technology Assessment Criteria, broader assurance frameworks, and also other frameworks such as NICE's evidence standards framework, frameworks which are more orientated towards cost effectiveness and utility in its broader meaning. And then finally, you have liability, so clinical negligence and so on. And all these things really, really sit together. They're all part of the picture of regulation. So at the moment, through the Multi-Agency Advisory Service, we're doing a bit of a gap analysis in terms of, is there any gap in regulation really here? I think the overall conclusion is that there's probably not. In fact, there's more often overlaps when you take into account all of these different processes that are going on. So there are needs, there are gaps to fill, but there isn't a need for a wholly new regulator is probably the conclusion so far. So carrying on, medical device regulation. So in very broad terms, it's really concerned with two things. I'm concerned with two things primarily. So it's the acceptability in terms of the risk-benefit ratio that a device provides, and also whether it meets its intended use. And so that intended use is constructed through looking at the promotional claims and the instructions for use and the actual function of the device as well. But really just to say, it's inherently limited because we're looking primarily at that final product. It requires MHRA to sit within the ecosystem and communicate with other regulators. So ultimately, I don't regulate the data that goes into a device. But more and more, as AI as a medical device comes forward, it requires me to look further into those processes, especially when you consider, large industries such as genomics now. They all have, polygenic risk scores are kind of the new big thing. There's a whole bioinformatics pipeline, which speaks to the quality of that end device, which the MHRA needs to get its head around. So again, it's becoming more complex and really more difficult to assess some of these devices. So there's also a changing legislative landscape in the UK. So if you didn't notice, we left the EU earlier this year. Hopefully you noticed. It was a minor political event, I'm sure you'll agree. So currently in Great Britain, we're operating on the directives. Those were primarily written in the 90s and updated in the late 2000s, and they're kind of codified into this medical device regulations 2002. That's the current law that applies in Great Britain. And we're accepting CE marking from Europe until 30 June 2023. But we also passed this piece of law called the Medicines and Medical Devices Act. That does a couple of things. It gives us some new powers, but one of those really interesting powers is the ability to change that medical device regulation 2002 to amend and supplement that. The MHRA is not in the habit of accumulating powers that we don't use. We intend to use those powers. One of those areas of change that's been outlined is really a need for bold change, a really substantive update, and a place for the UK to lead in is in software and AI in particular. So we intend to do a better job of regulation. We intend to update those regulations and try to be best in class where we can. But also, just to point out, there are new regulations that apply in Northern Ireland because they're still subject to EU law. So one of those just came into play in May this year, and the next one will come into play at the same time next year. So what does the medical device life cycle look like? There's really four broad phases. Qualification is the question of what constitutes a medical device and what is not. So what is software as a medical device? What is just a lifestyle or well-being device? Classification, not all software or not all medical devices are created equal. So once you're a medical device, you get classed. So there's class 1, class 2, class 1, class 2A, class 2B, and then 3. I'll tell you more about that in a second. You also have the pre-market phase, what you have to assemble before you go to market. In very broad general terms, what it requires is that you demonstrate conformity with the essential requirements. They're in Annex 1 of the Medical Device Directive. It's a medical device. And also that you have a clinical evaluation report, which demonstrates that device has acceptable risk-benefit ratio and provides further evidence. And post-market, you're required to keep a track of your device, what it's doing, when it's going wrong, and so on. So there are dynamic duties that apply to you as a manufacturer. So I'll go through some of those in more detail now as well. So software, what counts as software? As you can see, software has an extremely broad definition. It's just a set of instructions that processes input data and creates output data. So anything really that you think should count as software will count as software under the directive. What's a medical device? Well, it's really kind of, there are the purposes outlaid on the right there. If it's kind of doing something vaguely along those lines, it will be a medical device. How do we kind of assess whether the intended purpose is specifically medical, whether it's really intended for those purposes? Well, we look to things like, as I was saying, the labeling, the instructions for use, promotional materials, the actual function of the device, but also how the reasonably informed consumer would look at that device as well. So it's not good enough to have disclaimers which say this isn't a medical device. MHRA will look at that. Well, if it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, but the disclaimer says it's not a duck, well, the disclaimer is not really effective in the MHRA's terms. Apologies, there's a plane flying overhead. What kind of breadth of software as a medical device are we seeing? What kind of software qualifies as a medical device? Well, here's some idea of really the breadth of what's out there. So there's breadth of applications across the board. So it's everything from screening, medical imaging, stratification, triaging, diagnosis, prognosis, treatment, and management of chronic conditions. So really a whole bunch of applications that come across my and the team's desk is really kind of, it's mind-boggling. But also to say, there's a breadth of experience that is going into those devices currently. So there's two broad trends that I track here. So there's big pharma that are going digital, your large pharmaceutical companies, your large traditional medical device manufacturers that are now entering the digital market. But at the same time, you have a digital market which have nothing to do with healthcare or the medical device industry going into this industry often for the first time. In my view, a proper regulation for software as a medical device and AI as a medical device requires the best of both worlds. It requires the best of the medical device industry and the best of, say, the data science industry to come together. Neither side has all the answers. Both sides have most of the answers we need, in my view. Apart from that, there's also breadth of qualification. So you have standalone devices, say like a triaging app on your phone could be a standalone device, but sometimes, you know, AI or software is included as a component, an accessory, a system, a module. It could be an in vitro diagnostic medical device. It could be part of an IVD kit, or it could be a companion diagnostic meant to work with a regulated medicine. So there's a breadth of qualification about how all of these devices fit together and how they work. Again, more complexity. But there's also a breadth of complexity in the devices we're seeing in themselves. So relatively simple clinical calculators we see come across our desks all the time. You know, some relatively simple calculations, you know, more calculus-based, which aren't easily verifiable. But at the same time, you know, we're seeing kind of AI onions, or rather AI with multiple layers, you know, say an image classification layer with a Bayesian layer on top for decision support analysis. So obviously, those multiple layered devices that include AI are more difficult to assess whether they're safe and effective and whether they'll function as intended when they're put out into the wild. So software as medical device classification, there are 4 risk classes that you can see there. If you're class 1, the MHRA will probably not see that device, or a notified body, a third party, will not see that device unless something goes wrong or unless we raise our eyebrow. So they're self-certified, you self-declare. The rest of them require an approved body or notified body assessment. And so those risk classes will probably change in the future as well going forward. But just to point out, software as a medical device can pose a novel risk profile as well. So for example, you know, here are some ideas about how it can cause a different risk versus other medical devices and IVDs. So it can be deployed at scale. So we have seen some open sourcing of medical devices recently. There's no good way for the MHRA to control the distribution of those devices. Frankly, once they're out there, it's kind of like Pandora's box has been opened. Anyone can download those, modify it, and release it again, and they de facto become a legal manufacturer of a medical device. But we have no good way of enforcing our powers upon them, obviously. But also it's dynamic, so you can update, of course, versus hardware much quicker, much faster. But also, especially in relation to AI, there's a non-linearity of change really as well. So if you could change a small part of your data set, that could cause a large drop in performance or a large increase in performance for your AI model. Further, you know, as your lines of code increase, the probability that those lines of code will have a bug reaches 1. And it's not predictable. It's really difficult to understand, you know, what the impact will be upon patients or the clinician if there is a bug in there. But also lots of these devices are networked. So that means they present a risk in terms of cybersecurity, hacking, or just even data loss. And then finally, we know there's a large piece of literature out there which demonstrates that the way humans interact with computers is different from how humans interact with, say, hardware or other humans. That is, there are things like automation bias that we have to be aware of. So this is a very texty slide. Don't bother reading it. I'll give you the kind of Cliff Notes versions. And the Cliff Notes version is this. The current rule, which distinguishes between class 1 software and 2A software, looks at direct diagnosis for software. And that's a really difficult determination to make. But essentially, if you're providing decisive information for making a diagnosis, that means you'll be class 2A or above. And often manufacturers are looking to avoid that precisely because you're required to go through an approved body or a notified body process if you're 2A and above. So this is the real point of contention in classification of software as a medical device currently, and something that needs to change to bring it back in line with international standards, because this is behind now and it's based on rules, again, that were made in the 90s and only updated in 2000s. So what's the international trends? So these rules are being updated. So the IMDRF, which is the international body for regulators, there's a harmonized view of risk classification, and it's much more subtle than that just direct diagnosis or not, and then further details after that. It looks at the significance of the information that the software provides, but also the state of healthcare, the state of the healthcare situation or condition that it kind of provides that information for. And some of those rules are even more subtle. So that means, you know, basically, you see the EU version of that rule implemented. It does mean that a lot of class 1 software that's currently out there, which currently characterizes the market. So as we saw earlier, there are 4 risk categories, but out of those categories, by far and away, the majority are class 1 devices. So about 3/4 are in that 1/4 of class 1. under that EU law, which only applies in Northern Ireland and not currently in Great Britain, but we may do something similar. Those devices will generally be up classified to 2A and above. So carrying on. Let's get to the kind of the really interesting stuff that most people are here to talk about. AI as a medical device, where are we going? What are the plans, and what do we need to get our heads around? So here's some context setting. First of all, there is no definition of AI as a medical device currently out there. There is one being worked on internationally, but frankly, because the definition of software is so broad, most anything that is AI, which would count as a medical device, it's the medical device component which is doing the work there. So most everything counts as software. So we can get around that fairly easily, but there are also international efforts to update key medical device standards. So that's 13485, 14971, and 62304. So that's quality management systems, risk management, and also software lifecycle processes. All of those standards are being looked at from the perspective of AI to say what tweaks these standards need to happen to ensure that they're fit for purpose for AI. Generally, my perspective coming at it is I want to avoid wherever possible AI exceptionalism. So AI is not created equal, as Maria rightly pointed out. So sometimes AI can pose only a small measure of performance over and above, or even a drop in performance versus hand-coded models or even humans. And then, you do have models which are more out there, which do seek to replace humans as part of the workflow. So in my view, AI is the genus. But in that genus, you have a different kind of set of risk profiles. You have the house cat and the tiger. We should regulate them according to their risk. The house cat as the house cat and the tiger as the tiger. So again, not all AI is created equal. And you'll see some of that thinking represented further on. But also just to say that the bulk of our market currently, including AI as medical device, is primarily towards the diagnosis or triaging end of the spectrum. We see few things that constitute medical device beyond those two kind of uses. So here are a few challenges that we need to overcome for medical device regulation, how it applies to AI. So there's really kind of three broad challenges that will break it down to: interpretability, evidencing, and also adaptivity. So I'll go through those in turn now. So AI interpretability, anyone that works in the machine learning field will be probably very well versed in that seminal Bryman article, the hand-coded model being represented by that diagram on the left, and kind of the algorithmic modeling culture approach being represented on the right. One of the consequences for the approach on the right is that you can have, what people term a black box. I think people push back upon that term, but let that stand for the second. And one of the problems there is uninterpretable. It's not exactly clear about how it mapped from X to Y, or how it came to the decision it did. And the weighting between those parameters is not necessarily known, or too complex to be digestible, really. So that there are two challenges that really fall out of that for me, two primary ones. The first is linking that model to known clinical and scientific evidence, or otherwise validating that model. It's a more difficult task, which we'll talk about again in a second. There's also the human factors component. So I'm really interested in the performance of the human AI team. Patients don't care whether they're misdiagnosed because of the model or because of how the clinician interpreted the model. They care about the result, which is having the correct diagnosis. So that means because a lot of AI is a human AI team, it doesn't fully replace a human in the loop. That means the ultimate criterion for performance is not the model itself, but it's the model with the human in the loop. And how they interpret it. So that means human factors is incredibly important, and possibly one of the biggest risk claims and one of the biggest safety angles which you need to cover off when developing AI as a medical device. Evidencing AI. So there are a few challenges to point out. As I've noted, linking to clinical or scientific evidence can be more difficult if you don't know what features your model relied upon, or to the extent that your model relied upon those features. Also, because AI sometimes makes claims that it's better than the human, that means the gold standard is no longer the reference standard. The standard is kind of increasing as we go on. As I've noted, human factors are increasingly important and one of the biggest parts of the safety of a medical device going forward. But also the representativeness of training data and the generalizabilities of those models is really important, and they can be sensitive to changes across a jurisdiction. So what works in the US population does not necessarily work in the UK. So MHRA is working to ensure that generalizability is respected and tested for when those deployments across borders happen. Moreover, reproducibility, we know that the literature for machine learning in this space, there are issues with reproducibility of certain machine learning models. So again, that speaks to the solid foundation or the lack of solid foundation that some devices have to go to market. Finally, as well, two other extra points. It's really difficult to claim equivalence between models for the purposes of clinical evidence. So if you standardly in medical devices, you'll often rely on the evidence of another device already at market to say my device is similar to that, so I can go to market. That's really difficult with AI because there's very little, you often have no access to the data of another device. You often have no access to what features it relied upon and so on. So that means drawing a link between equivalence is really difficult in this space. And finally, because we are starting to enter the age of personalized medicine, the calibration of models is going to be really important, not just for personalized medicine purposes, but also for radiology, for example, calibrating it towards the particular MRI machine and things like that is becoming increasingly important. So carrying on, AI and bias, three random kind of, not three random, three hopefully highly structured thoughts about how to break this problem down from our perspective as well into three different issues. So really, AI can pose three problems, although it's not really just AI that poses these problems. So the first is that unrepresentative data can lead to lower performance in subpopulations. Medical device requirements and the guidance that accompanies that is already very, very clear that you must demonstrate that your device and the evidence that accompanies that is representative of the entire intended population with all, the intended purpose with all patient populations and claims foreseen for the device under evaluation. So we would be expecting people to have performance that their device does perform across, that they have evidence that the device performs across subpopulations. Second of all, even representative data but without context can lead to poorer outcomes. And this kind of idea, I'm not necessarily thinking about the health industry, but I'm thinking about algorithms like the Compass sentencing algorithm, which disproportionately sentenced African-American folks to higher and longer sentences. The data that algorithm relied upon was correct, but it lacked the context of injustice, which led to those poor outcomes and that poor data. So the same is true of the medical industry, is that you can have representative data, but if you do not have the context in which that data was collected, then it can lead to a poor outcome, a poor health outcome for subpopulations within that set. But also, if you have a homogeneous developer population as well, it may not serve the needs of communities in which it's deployed. So we're keen to make sure that devices serve everyone in the UK and really cover subpopulations and minority populations where we can impose that. Finally, the last problem, AI adaptivity. So AI can retrain. That poses a number of kind of issues for regulating because it's a moving target. I really think this is kind of four problems in one. And so when the MHRA goes about addressing this, I'm very keen that we address each problem in turn and we not conflate all of AI as being number 4 there, which is continuous learning on streaming data. I'm not seeing any devices currently on the market that are regulated that do that, and that's for a reason, is because it's really difficult to assure that your device maintains performance over time and doesn't fall off a cliff when you're doing that. So here's the kind of 4 problems briefly. Static devices, their performance can change over time, obviously, because data drift can occur, and that means the performance can drop. That can, depending on the application, be as much of a risk as an adaptive device. So it really depends on the application. Again, we need to have more clear requirements about what we require devices to demonstrate over time. Second of all, you can retrain in batches. You can do batch training. Really what's required there is for the MHRA to streamline existing processes. So once you've deployed your algorithm on the market, you can batch train it, but you also clearly know what you must provide to the MHRA in terms of evidence that it's maintained performance over time. We're also seeing some kind of slightly weirder models, what I'm calling individualized models. So here I'm thinking about artificial pancreases. So that's where the overall machine learning model, the characteristics for each individual patient, the performance just looks completely different. Everyone gets their own kind of model. The training has very few performance characteristics in common with others. So that to me looks more like a custom-made device rather than one single device. And then finally, you have the more organic kind of continuous learning on streaming data. That will happen, in my view, it will probably happen in the next 3 to 5 years in this industry. We need to be ready for it, but MHRA needs to regulate for the here and now first and the future second. So we will attack that problem, but in the future. So again, I think I'm very happy to take any questions. There was one question in the chat. It did involve a particular manufacturer. I am not able to talk about any particular manufacturer because I'm bound by confidentiality. But you can probably get the impression, about what I think about the broad question about whether it requires more regulation. I think the key question is it requires more clarity of regulation. It requires more guidance for manufacturers to abide by, and does require some tightening up, in my view. So that's precisely what we'll try to do over the next couple of years. But again, MHRA cannot do this alone. We are a small organization relatively to the population of devices. We don't have all of the expertise that we need. Some of that expertise is sitting in this kind of virtual lobby now. So it's an open call. If you're interested in having a chat, if you have research that I can steal, to increase the safety and effectiveness of medical devices in the UK, I'm looking to steal it. So please get in contact. It's just my first name dot last name at mhra.gov.uk. But also that particular address there will get you where you need to go. Chris, I have broken my promise at going
No,
past the hour.
It's all fine. We're running. We started just 5 minutes late anyway, so we're still on time.
Fantastic.
To some extent. So thanks for that. That was a fantastic talk, Johan. And before we move over to the panel discussion, there is one question in the chat, which I shall ask now from Nada. And they ask, could you further elaborate on advice for taking on technologies that have the required CE marking into practice within the NHS? Would you still advise undergoing clinical trials, or can it be trialed in routine clinical practice directly?
I think it's an interesting question. It depends what it is and whether it's fit for purpose. So CE marking, and UKCA marking, which currently applies in GB, will give you a baseline, a decent baseline for some, depending on whether the manufacturer has kept the rules or not. But for some applications, for instance, screening is one of them. UKCA marking will provide some assurance for those screening processes, but it will never be enough to justify, a device being taken up by a screening program. So it really depends on the kind of application you have in mind, whether UKCA marking will be sufficient for you to kind of just take that as given and go forward. But I would always encourage people to do trials or require, say, a NICE evaluation, or take into account those extra frameworks, because we're interested in the safety and that it meets the intended use. There's no guarantee that intended use is useful or particularly helpful, right? So those extra assessments are really required to directly address those questions. Chris, was that an answer to the question? Maybe it was, but slightly long-winded.
Yep, I hope so. And if not, they will have a chance to ask again in the next half an hour. So thanks for that. And now I'll be handing over to Angela, who will be chairing the panel discussion.
Thanks, Chris. So I'm Angela Davis. I'm a Director of Digital Transformation and Healthcare Education at the University of Manchester, well, it was particularly in the School of Health Sciences. And very briefly, my role has been over the last sort of 18 months or so to focus on training and education initiatives to prepare the workforce to digitally transform. And we've been working with cohorts such as the Topple Fellows. You'll see I posted a link to our MOOC that we've worked on. So that's a particular area of interest of mine and the teams that I work with at the university. But back to the panel session. So what I wanted to do was invite all of our speakers back, which I think they've done. They're all sharing the video, which is fantastic. So I can see them on one screen, which I thought was going to be a challenge given the number of people we've got, which is fantastic. So what I'd like to do is, so I'm going to invite you in to respond to some of these sort of areas that we'd like to focus on. So we've got one or two that have cropped up that we'll come on to in the chat. So please do feel free to add any more to all of our participants in the chat conversation there. But I'd like to start off the panel session firstly by thanking you all for absolutely fantastic presentations, because I think you've given us so much to think about and so much to explore in this session. But first of all, I'd like to bring it back to the patient. We've touched on PPI, we've touched on patient involvement. I think it's really important. We're here to talk about translating into the clinic and to help improve service. So my first question really to the panel is, where do you think AI can make the most difference to patients and to the delivery of clinical service? And I guess as there's sort of two clinicians, perhaps I'll start with Alistair and then Zhao to kind of respond to that to start off with.
Okay, so I can give a first answer. I mean, it's huge, isn't it? It's a little bit, sometimes when people open that particular question, I think it's a bit like saying, well, where can statistics be useful? It's just so broad in its application as a range of tools. But if I look at where I'm excited to see it being deployed, I think one of the things is around raising consistency of standards. And I think there is something around the democratization of expert care, and particularly in diagnosis and prognosis, where I think there's a real opportunity here. So that's probably the area that I'm most excited to see early deployment. I think also where I see a lot of wasted energy is where a model of replacing a human in a system approach is taken, rather than necessarily thinking about, well, let's reimagine the system and then see where these technologies can help. And I think a lot of the barriers to adoption and the challenges of evaluation come where we say, well, we've got to make it as safe or as user-friendly or as patient acceptable as a human, and you're kind of trying to compare an analog and digital system, and I think that often doesn't work. So some opening comments. Zhao?
I think my answer is very similar. I was going to talk about access to care and efficiency of care, as well as some of the sort of the more mature algorithms that we have now, which are around prediction and diagnosis. There's also a whole host of algorithms which are around making the whole health system function more efficiently. And those will have lots of indirect benefits to patients, just simply from having smoother clogs within the health system, and getting the right patient seen at the right time. I guess there's also a lot of excitement around patient-facing devices and sort of enabling and empowering patients to manage their own care, or at least access care outside of the traditional health system. And I think that would be really, really great as well for patients.
Thanks, Zhao. I'm going to bring Paul in as well, because Paul's actually been involved in translating an algorithm into clinical practice in radiography. So Paul, do you want to come in on that one?
So I'd agree with the points that Alistair and Zhao have raised. I'm naturally biased to think about radiology because that's the area I primarily work in. And people have been predicting the crisis in radiology for quite some time now. But we might be seeing a tipping point where we're just not recruiting radiologists fast enough to keep up with their current workload and train a sufficient number of radiologists to form the next generation. And we don't have enough radiologists to meet both requirements anymore, given the increasing amount of imaging that's done in clinical practice. So the only way out of this is to make the NHS radiology more efficient by not replacing radiologists, but giving them tools that let them do their job much more quickly. And so we're not looking at the sort of the classic black box replacement for a clinician. We're looking at something that facilitates someone's job, ideally at the point where it's an automation that just disappears into the background. You don't even notice it's there. But I'd also agree with the idea of the patient-facing end of this, that communication with patients, getting patients to be more involved in their own care, directing it, providing them information, all of that can be facilitated by technological solutions.
Brilliant, thanks, Paul. Okay, so what I'd like to have a think about then is, where do we think the key factors, we've talked about many of them this afternoon, but what do we think the key factors are in ensuring successful adoption into the clinic? Perhaps we could start with Johan and then Maria on this one.
Yeah, of course. So I think starting your design process. Sorry, I'll get the word out eventually, Angela. With a clinical need, first of all, but also considering not every clinical need hole is one that AI should fill or is appropriate for AI to fill. So having a design process which includes, the end user in mind from the very start, but also one that takes into account not just MHRA processes, but NICE processes in terms of, cost effectiveness from the beginning, I think is really important to shape the design of the device. I'm sorry, I'm really having a struggle. I'm just going to stop talking now, Angela, and hand it back to you.
No problem. You've had a long talk. Maria, do you want to come in?
Yeah, so I think for me, a critical thing, and it will sound pretty trivial, is not to make mistakes that undermine people's trust. And we've seen that in other areas that are not AI. If people suddenly perceive something to be unsafe, it's going to be really hard, even if you demonstrate it in a really objective way, really hard to convince them otherwise. So I think it's important to make sure that every step that we make is robust and solid, and to earn the trust of everybody involved, but particularly the public.
I think that's a really timely end to my next question, but also one that's come up on the chat there, which is around, we've touched, but not in any great depth today, on the human factors element. We've heard about the Decide AI, which I think it'd be interesting to hear a little bit more about if you've got any more detail on that, Alistair and Zhao. But also, I'm interested in, I think one of the key things we need to think about is how do we prepare the workforce for adoption of AI into clinical practice? How do we get them mentally ready, thinking about it in terms of the clinical workflow? So perhaps I don't know, Alistair, Zhao, if you want to start with that one.
I'll have a go at it, and then I'll hand over to Alistair as well. So Decide AI is upcoming. It's in the last stages of development now, and it will it's specifically targeting this area. So I won't give any specifics because won't do the whole paper justice, but essentially it's being really aware of the fact that there is a learning curve with these algorithms, that behavior from the human end when interacting with these algorithms aren't necessarily predictable. There's lots of factors to think about in terms of automation bias. And it's having a proper evaluation process in place for those things, rather than just embedding it as part of an evaluation process that's looking at a totally different outcome. It requires its own investigation and should be done actually before the sort of large scale evaluations like you might do in a clinical trial. So those are the important points around human factors, I think, in terms of generating evidence. And on your point about upskilling the healthcare system and the people within it, I absolutely agree. I think we've got a lot of work to do. I think we have a degree of education and upskilling of clinicians and other healthcare professionals. But I actually think we have a huge amount of work to do in preparing the infrastructure to safely get these algorithms off the ground, safely implement them, and have the resources and the systems in place to monitor for their safety through tools like auditing, to be able to support the regulatory frameworks for post-market surveillance. So there's a lot of work around that is not necessarily going to be in the hands of just the developers or the regulators, but also the health institutions.
Thanks, Zhao. Alistair, do you want to?
Yeah, if I could just follow, I think one of the things that Zhao touched on there is that point about actually it needs to be trustworthy, and sometimes when you hear discussion in this space, there's a sort of sense of, oh, well, it's, these Luddites won't take on this shiny new kind of technology that's clearly ready and will benefit patients, and why are they blocking it? So there is some attitude of, help, this is different, this is new, I'm not comfortable with this. But there is also actually, I think we need to earn that trust, and all the speakers have touched on the fact that a lot of these devices don't necessarily have the evidence that they are immediately deployable into complex real world scenario and will cause benefit to patients. And I think the more that these tools, whether they're simple or whether they're complex, are shown to be of benefit in the real world and make people do their able to deliver their jobs more effectively, then you will get this massive pull, and appropriately so, because then the technology is not only trusted but trustworthy.
Thank you. I think that's a real theme, isn't it? It's coming through, not just human factors, but the trust aspect. I guess that brings me in quite nicely when we're thinking about, so I think, Paul, you gave a really nice summary of one of the awards that people might consider going for with the Health and Care Awards. So what do you think a successful team might look like for going for funding for AI, sort of, if it's a Health and Care Award?
So I touched on this a bit. The basic criterion is, does the team have the breadth of expertise necessary to deliver the project that you've proposed? Typically, you're never going to find in such a complex thing as an AI system that you're intending to deploy in healthcare through a commercial entity. You're never going to find all those skills in a single person. And so you need to build together each one of those components. There will always be an algorithm development side. There's always going to be a clinical side. So there's going to be involvement with the NHS. It's increasingly important that you have that PPI side. So the patient voice needs to be heard, because you are affecting the lives of real people and the way they move through the healthcare system and their experiences. So they've got every right to direct that process. I think one of the other speakers mentioned that in practice, it's very difficult to deploy one of these systems solely as a university. Universities make very poor software companies. So you need that industrial side as well. And they bring skills with the regulatory approvals and maintaining that regulatory approval isn't a one-shot process. It's continuing, as Johan said. So in terms of once you've identified those components, the critical thing is you've got a team that works efficiently together. And I don't think there is a magical special sauce that you can pour over it and make that happen. It happens with certain groups of people. It doesn't happen with others. And you just need to find a group that works efficiently.
I think something else, I can't remember, I think it's Maria mentioned co-creation as well. And I think that's something that I just want, yeah, do you want to come in on that, Maria?
Yeah, so as I was listening to Paul, I was thinking of the co-creation element, the having the patients involved throughout the entire process, and not as a feedback process, but as active elements of the development process is, I think I completely agree, really valuable. But I also wanted to add a bit of data that I learned recently, reading a report published by McKinsey, I think it was last year, from the very business, very corporate world. Sometimes, particularly us moving in academic spheres, are maybe not so familiar with. And they looked at companies that had been implementing digital health and AI in as part of their development strategy, and they looked at the ones that had actually benefited from it, because a lot of companies are doing it, but not a lot are being successful in actually increasing their revenue or whatever. So they looked at the ones that did, and looked at the common characteristics of those. And one of the things that they found, which was pretty clear, is that, again, it might sound obvious, but the ones that succeeded were the ones that had actual experts in AI and more like algorithmic development, all the way up to the C-suite. So they had executives who actually understood what they were doing. And I thought that was pretty revealing, because it says that there's a lot of companies out there which are trying to do this, but actually don't have the expertise in all of the levels. And that can be an issue when you're dealing with huge companies, maybe not so much when you have a small team developing something, on a relatively small scale, everyone working together. But when you have these bigger companies, it can really be an issue.
I think, Alistair, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I just echo both those points. And I think Paul really captured it very nicely. And for anybody who wants to go in for this award, which I think is a great award, I think really take Paul's words to heart. And because having reviewed a lot of these grants coming through, it's really obvious that a lot of them come from a single sector. And Paul touched on this beautifully in his talk, but the ones that are purely from a company just nearly always don't give that feel that actually they're responding to a genuine need in the NHS, and they're creating something very cool, very clever, very shiny, but actually nobody's asking for it. And they often do have a clinical collaborator, but it may not even be in the right specialty. It's clearly a personal contact that is providing, saying, yeah, that sounds good. But flip side is that that products that are also kind of really nicely meeting an unmet need, but are generated fairly amateurly, and that's not meant derogatively, but it's just an observation, but either within NHS sector or NHS combined with university sector, but from a group that doesn't have experience of that kind of spinning out into sort of commercialization. Again, that really comes through. You don't see that awareness of standards. You don't see that sense of pipeline and so on. So I just, I think this session has been recorded, but I'd urge you to listen to Paul's talk again. It's gold dust, as I think Chris said. Yeah.
Thanks, Alistair. So I think two really strong points there is an absolute clear understanding that there is a problem and the defining the problem. And actually what Maria said there, I think around getting buy-in from senior stakeholders in the healthcare system is absolutely key, I think, as well. And we talk about this more and more in terms of this team science. We don't necessarily need people to build algorithms, but we need them to understand the language and the terminology, especially if we're going to adopt these into clinical practice. I will bring in Matt's question now because he asked it earlier as well. So Matt Craddock asked, how do we assess clinical utility of AI systems outside of clinical trials? I'll throw this open to whoever wants to come in. Yeah.
I'll take that one. I think that probably was prompted by when I said that the evaluation of human factors shouldn't be lumped into another trial assessing something else. You want to assess clinical utility within the space, ideally with a comparative arm. So a comparative interventional trial is going to give you the best level of evidence in terms of what your utility is. You can simulate this to a degree using retrospective studies, using reader studies, if you have data to simulate the outcomes that it might then produce. But just to clarify what I was saying earlier, I wasn't saying that the study design of a clinical trial wasn't appropriate for human factors. It was more just that you need to be specific about that outcome and you shouldn't conflate multiple outcomes in the same study design.
Thanks, Shell. I think, so Chris has asked a question here, an important one that, again, we've not really touched a lot on today because there was too much to cover, I think, which is probably around bias in data sets. So how do we ensure that AI reaches all parts of society, in particular less connected parts where we have difficulties, we know already, obtaining representative data and potentially challenges with interactions with the health and care and social system? Yeah, who wants to come in on that one? Okay, Alistair, thanks.
So, I mean, this is not a complete answer, but and probably many others can contribute to this. Yeah, this is a big issue. We did a survey of all the publicly available ophthalmic imaging data sets, and we chose that because personal interest, but also because that is one of the areas at the vanguard, like radiology, of these AI solutions. And what we identified there was just how poorly represented most of the globe is, both in terms of countries, but also even within particular nations, that large parts of society may be neglected, that these publicly available data sets are based on quite narrow cohorts, and you might not even have the data you need on those, such as demographic data, to really know how representative they are. So it is a big problem, and that was just one survey. And in the chat, I've just put a review in terms of some of the areas we think that can be looked at to address this. But whilst there is a lot of, quite rightly, there's a lot of discussion around algorithm bias, I guess our interest as a group has been particularly about getting the data foundation right first, and then also considering these kind of downstream bias effects.
Thanks, Alistair. Does anyone want to add anything else? Okay.
Can I?
Oh, go on, Jill, sorry.
I was just going to say that the only way that you can know if you have discrepant performance in different subgroups of the population is if you test for it. So being aware of the problem is half the issue. And then, as Alistair was saying, the only way you can test for it is if you have data that's sufficiently well labeled to demarcate those different subpopulations. And the only way that you can have the data available there is if it's collected in the right way. But also, I think we have to be really aware that you can't necessarily solve the problem by solving the data problem. Some of the biases are reflective of the biases that are just permeating through society. And so we can, the first step is to be aware of it and to make sure we have a true reflection of these biases within the algorithm's performance. And then the second step is trying to solve them. Yeah.
Thank you. Paul.
So just one more point, the PPI organisation that I pointed out in my presentation, Vocal, specialise in this particular area of patient engagement with disadvantaged communities, and they're doing a lot of work. There's a catch-22 of how do you engage with people who won't engage, and so you need specialists to, again, increase the breadth of the skills you have in your team and help you to deal with that, and they're one of the organisations that can help, so you can always approach them.
Thank you. It's really great to know there's specialist help out there. I'm going to, on that note, I'm going to finish with a question primarily to Johan, but if anyone else would like to come in, then what I want to finish with, I guess, to the panel is, where do our SME colleagues, our researchers that are on the call, go for further support and advice to navigate their way through the regulatory process and trying to get something into clinic?
Shall I take that first?
Please.
Yeah, so first of all, if it's about medical device regulation, there is softwaremhra.gov.uk. That inbox is open. We have limited staff. We do the best we can, and we can try point you in the right direction or just give you an answer back. There's also something else we're working on, the multi-agency advisory service. So that is open for comment. That is a lot of the arm's length bodies in this space all sitting down together. So that is MHRA, NICE, CQC, and HRA all in the same room, all saying, look, a lot of this information that we require of developers, we have in common. Often the requirements we have overlap. And so, where those things overlap, they should be aligned, and that complexity should be hidden from market as much as possible. So we would welcome comment on the design of that service. So that service is not fully up and running yet, but it will be informed by people's comment and what they think that they need from the regulators, essentially. So that service will assist people along the way. But also NHSX are putting out some really good kind of signposting. And I think you'll see a big shift in the MHRA's approach as well. We need to do a better job, frankly. Medical device regulation is weird and scary, and it's mostly inaccessible to people. It's very technical. So we need to do a better job in communicating what it is, why it's important, and what you have to do. Acknowledging that is a complex series of questions that requires a complex answer, but the actual steps you need to take are fairly well known and fairly simple. So we need to outline those first. But also, of course, welcome the other panelists to comment as well.
Thank you. If anyone else would like to come in for any other sources that they would recommend?
Maybe if I can add, I mean, Jonathan's answer is very good in terms of the sources, but if I could add the recommendation to not just engage with these sources, but in fact do it early. Sometimes it can be a bit scary, it can be a bit daunting, and you think, well, I'm going to work on the development first, and then I'll deal with the regulatory process, which will come at some point, further down the line. And in fact, it's much easier, it's much better if you do it right at the very beginning. Start talking to them, start asking questions, start seeing what it is that you need to do, and that way the whole process will be much easier.
Excellent advice, I think. I'd just like to finish a final one that's come through in the chat there. You might be able to see. So Corin has asked, how can you ensure that your AI tool is dynamic, adapts to rapid changes in the healthcare setting, and adapts to the local population needs? I think Alistair's put some response there, but if anyone wants to come in against that.
I'll just say my response was really to the previous question about data diversity. I think just to Corin, and I'll just some opening comments and others can follow. One of the things is about not seeing this as a one-off hit and run, and this is actually often where the partnerships, where there is an industry partner, whether SME or larger, is much more likely to have that whole pipeline approach and a product lifecycle approach, and the idea that you're iterating responsively and have that inbuilt to the system, I think is important. But what I would say is that normally things fail, not because they've not responded, but they've not actually understood the need in the first place. So I think getting that first step right is really key.
Thank you, Alistair. I'm conscious of time now, and I don't want to keep, it's been a fantastic afternoon, but it's been a long workshop. So I'm going to thank all of our panelists for their staying on for the panel session and for your engagement, everyone, and hand back over to Chris to close the workshop. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Angela, and thanks to all our speakers for some really interesting thoughts and insights today. It's always great to see all of you again. I see many of you individually, but I've never seen you all as a group, so that's a great thing for me to have organised. I'm going to bring this workshop to a close, and just again, thanks to all the speakers as well as audience participants for engaging in this workshop today. Thanks also to my co-organisers, Angela and David, for helping set this up, as well as Nicola and Orla, who are from the Pankhurst, who are working behind the scenes to make everything happen. As we mentioned, this workshop is part of a series which is organised by the Pankhurst, and the next episode of that series occurs next week, so go to the website for more information. If there are any more further questions or follow-ups that you might be interested in engaging our speakers about today, please do contact me via email or on Twitter, and I will pass these on as appropriate after this workshop closes. Otherwise, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Thanks to the speakers, and have a good rest of the afternoon. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.